You are listening to the Age Like a Boss podcast, episode 6. Today, as part of my ongoing series about my 2024 Menopause Metabolic Makeover, I'll cover some background foundational information about diabetes, what causes it, insulin resistance, and cover a few more steps that you can take to apply evidence-based science to your metabolic health. Don't go away. Hey everyone, welcome to the Age Like a Boss podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Singh. Hey, welcome to the Age Like a Boss podcast. If you're new here, I'm Jennifer Singh. I'm a trained internist and pediatrician and a board-certified lifestyle medicine physician, and I would love to share with you practical ways to get fit, lose weight, and age like a boss. Today, I am talking about part 2 of my 4-ish part series on my 2024 Menopause Metabolic Makeover. Now, I say 4-part-ish because the truth is this is sort of ongoing. Thankfully, I'm not sure we're ever completely done learning about new health and new scientific advances and how to implement them in our lives. So everything I'm sharing with you is sort of so far. This is what I know so far. This is what I've been able to implement so far. So if you want to go back and hear part 1 of this 4-part series on my Menopause Metabolic Makeover, feel free, but you don't have to. These are not in any particular order. Okay, I want to do a little bit of teaching for just a second about some of the foundations of glucose management and diabetes. Now, if you are from a scientific or medical background, forgive me. This is a really simple and I hope approachable way that I have explained diabetes and insulin resistance to those who don't have a scientific or health background in the past to kind of help them understand some of the different components of it. So first of all, I want everyone to understand that your metabolism or your metabolic health is simply how good is my machine working inside my body that is responsible for taking in energy in the form of food, changing that food into its primary components or its little building blocks. So that's carbohydrates, protein, and fats, and how they are broken down into their little parts. Those are either burned for energy or put into storage if we consume more than we need at the time. And then when it's called upon, when our body needs it, if everything is working properly, it can go into those storage areas and pull out some of those molecules and burn them for fuel. That's how things work when everything is great. But the underlying true cause of metabolic disorder appears to be the long-term overconsumption of energy. That's sort of where most of it starts. I like to examine this concept of blood glucose and try to help people understand that just having blood glucose elevations is not bad. That is actually our body working how it is supposed to. It's when those elevations are too high, too long, and we spend too much time with our blood glucose elevated that our body gets into problems. It's now believed that metabolic dysfunction or a mess up in the machinery of how we process our food and burn it for energy and store the extra is at the root of almost all major conditions that you've heard of and I've heard of and we don't really want, like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, strokes, even Alzheimer's, some autoimmune disease and inflammatory diseases, and even some cancers. So to say that it is critical that we pay attention to our metabolic health is an understatement. So after chronically overconsuming energy or calories for years and years, it appears that our bodies, which are good at storing this, sometimes in places that are very visible to us, like right under our skin, which we see as fat tissue, but also these extra energy, extra calories can be stored in places inside our body that you may not be able to see with your eyes. This is called visceral fat if it is stored underneath our abdominal muscles. It can also be stored in your liver, in our pancreas, and in our muscles. It is when extra energy begins to be stored in those places, our visceral abdominal fat, our liver, our pancreas, and our muscles, that we start to see problems with the machinery of how our metabolism is working, how our body is handling glucose, storing it, and burning it for energy and fats as well. Once fat gets stored in places that it's not supposed to, through a cascade of events, our insulin levels can begin to rise because the insulin receptors themselves don't work very well anymore. Now, I know I probably lost you right there if you don't have a recent background in cell biology or receptors. So forgive me if I give you a really simple picture to think of. If your blood glucose is like a sink full of water that's overflowing, and the tap is turned all the way on and water's gushing out of the tap, but the sink is clogged a little bit and it won't drain all the way, what you have is a problem with water overflowing, right? If we pretend that the water is our blood glucose, and every time we turn on the tap, it's when we've eaten a meal that's high in carbohydrates, and it turns on the tap, as long as the insulin receptors, which is the drain, is working or are working well, then we may not have too much of a problem. We turn on the tap, the water in there might fill up some, but the drain handles it and the water goes out, no problem. But when the sink becomes drained, turning on the tap can be a problem because the water can't drain out thoroughly. The clogged sink represents insulin receptors that are not working that well anymore. I like to comically use the word perky. They're just not perky anymore, but it's kind of a clogged sink. So if you were to call the plumber and come over and say, my sink is overflowing and the water's turned on full tap, if he just reached up, she or he just reached up and turned off the tap and said, there you go, I fixed your problem. That's the equivalent of just deciding that you're never going to eat a carbohydrate again. Have you fixed your sink overflow problem? Absolutely. Your blood glucose might actually look pretty well, but only weight loss can help reduce the blockage or improve the function of the insulin receptors, and exercise helps a lot also. So I knew that still the secret to my metabolic health was to try to reduce my body fat, gain more body muscle, and get that sink really cleaned out to really normalize that glucose handling. My goal is to be able to eat a carbohydrate-rich meal and have insulin receptors that work great so that I don't have an overflowing sink. Make sense? Okay, class is over. Let's move on to a few more steps that I did in my metabolic makeover to make sure that my sink, my glucose handling, was working as perfectly as it can. In part one of this, I covered some of the laboratory markers that we look at to determine metabolic health, and the two specifically that I was really wanting to lower were my hemoglobin A1C, which is a marker of your average blood glucose. It was normal, but mine was high normal. I wasn't too happy with it. And my LDL, or my bad cholesterol, which is a known cardiovascular risk factor. Again, mine was normal, but I don't want normal. I want like exemplary, right? So let's go ahead with a few more of the steps that I took to improve my metabolic health this year, which also conveniently did result in weight loss. Okay, now the first thing I'm about to tell you next is, to be honest, kind of controversial. I was actually pretty against the use of this device in people who are not diabetics until I realized that I had not tried it myself, nor had I really done a deep scientific dive on this. And so I decided it was time to do that. I chose to experiment with wearing a continuous glucose monitor, or a CGM, even though I am not diabetic. Now, let me tell you up front, I am not recommending that everyone do this. In fact, I have a whole nother series that I'm developing called CGMs, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Because although some very positive behavior change came out of it for me, it's possible also for it to really mess with your head, to be honest. So please don't go out and buy one. I just want to tell you about the behaviors that I was able to change because of wearing a CGM, and you don't need the CGM in order to change these behaviors. First, I dramatically reduced my consumption of processed flour and processed sugar. Now, I am not a carbophobe by any stretch. I don't believe that white sugar and white flour are evil. They're just organic molecules. That's all. However, I do believe that for some of us, me included, that when I consume white sugar and white flour, and I do find it's a little bit more impressive after I've been through menopause, that when I eat them, I have a hard time stopping. me regulating my intake of those and really stopping when I've had enough, it's just more difficult when I am eating white sugar and white flour products. So I decided I was just going to really, really cut back on those. I do still eat store-bought baked goods, but I make an effort to seek out those that are honestly fiber fortified. They're just loaded with fiber, and I eat them like a fiber source, which I'll cover in just a minute. I also cut back on my use of high processed flour and even natural sweeteners that still I have no problem overeating at all. So, although I at one time in my life did not consume white sugar, but did consume a lot of dates or maybe honey or maybe agave, the fact is that I still overeat those. So I decided to do an experiment with white flour products only that were fiber fortified or that I consumed with a lot of fiber or protein, and dramatically reduce the white sugar in my diet, only consuming it in real moderation or using a non-caloric substitute. I like stevia and monk fruit. Here's some of the cool benefits that came from this. I did find that my cravings and my desire for processed flour and processed sugar foods decreased. It actually got a lot easier. And when I want something sweet, honestly, I just use a stevia substitute to make myself a small portion of something like a little dessert. And the second awesome thing that happened was by decreasing these, I put myself in a calorie deficit, and that did result in some weight loss. And if you go back to the sink analogy, remember, weight loss is one of the powerful tools to help unclog that sink and get those insulin receptors and some other parts of metabolism within the cell working. Okay, next thing I did was get even a little more crazy about fiber. So if you know any plant-based eaters, fiber is really not a problem. It never has been a problem for me. But just when I thought maybe I couldn't eat any more fiber, I actually doubled down and did eat fiber. And even more. I'll tell you why. Because back in part one, I told you that I really wasn't eating breakfast every day anymore. I knew that when I did sit down to a plate, I needed to be even a little more conscious about my nutrients. I needed to really make sure, because I was in a calorie deficit, that I'm getting enough plant-based protein, I'm getting plenty of fiber, I'm getting plenty of nutrients. I couldn't just sit down and eat junk 3 times a day. I really needed to be thinking about nutrition. So I increased my fruits and vegetables and beans even more. I love to eat tortillas that are fiber enriched, hamburger buns that are fiber enriched, and even I found some bagels that were fiber enriched so that the fiber content of those is really high. And I even started taking a fiber supplement. At about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I would have a serving of psyllium husk supplement. Now, the benefits of fiber are well shown. Fiber slows down gut transit. It feeds the good bacteria in our gut. It helps our body eliminate some of the things that we don't want to keep recirculating and increasing levels, like estrogen and cholesterol. And it has a powerful effect on fullness and satiety. So one trick that I have shared with some of my clients and patients is if you are someone who feels like you have the evening witching hour, you know what I mean? Like maybe you think you've eaten in a way that you wanted to all day long, but then 4 or 5 o'clock happens, and due to fatigue and stress, you just sort of eat whatever you want, and then you get into that cycle of, oh, oops, I didn't mean to eat all that. I'll start over tomorrow. And that feels crummy, right? So one cool trick to try is an afternoon fiber cocktail of before your witching hour, kind of preloading with a little bit of fiber and a reasonable snack also at that time, if it helps you decrease your evening overeating. And that's all the steps I'll cover today. I hope that you got something out of this that you can implement. And remember that small gradual changes add up to big changes over the course of weeks or months. There's no need for perfection or even 100% execution. Just be curious and experiment with any of the steps that I shared with you. They are all evidence-based to help you increase your nutrients, promote plant-strong eating, help your body's own systems of hunger and fullness work better, and keep that metabolism and metabolic health moving in the right direction. All right, I'll see you soon for part 3.